What's up, future Shredlords? Welcome back. Death of the Fingers. We got asked on the Twitters about the 6 rules of soloing, so here we are, I guess. These are just my sort of like general guidelines. It's like the Pirate's Code, if you will. But they're very important. Obviously, these supervisory ideas is what I call them, are essential for being effective in a practice situation, and what you practice eventually becomes what you play. So obviously you want to diversify your practice sessions so it sounds more like playing music and less like practicing rudiments, which I think a lot of people mistake. So we're going to go through the 6 important ones, and there's going to be examples where you see me do sort of like a quasi-practice session, sort of demonstrating the idea to a certain degree. Let's put it at that. And after a couple topics are covered, we're going to go into like an improv where you'll see me do it with a backing track so that you get an idea about what it should sound like when you're basically playing along to music. So that's it for the intro. Let's get into this. All right, rule number 1 here has to be the mastery of the slippery note, if you will, the pivot note. So they're going to be notes outside the diatonic sequence that you're working in, whether it's G major or A minor or whatever it is, that are basically incredibly pleasing, but shift the focus of the music, of the solo, if you will, to a different perspective, if you will. It's outside the scale, if you will, but also in a way that is complementary. It's not dissonant, it's still complementary, right? So it's 2 colors that basically complement each other. They give you 2 different sort of flavors to play with. So that ability, if you will, to anticipate these pivot notes, these slippery notes that come from the harmonic minor, that come from the melodic minor, that also come from like the natural blues scale or whatever it is, or the diminished scale, all of these things, it's better to sort of develop the 6th sense. So you're like, oh, if I go down here to become diminished, and then just be able to know what diminished shape to play based off what it is that you're doing. That is way more practical and a lot better as far as a teaching strategy or a learning strategy, right? So that's something you got to develop, is this mastery over the slippery notes. You got to know where they are, but it's like ramping up. First, you're just kind of swinging around in the dark, but eventually you start to get on a few of them and you're like, okay, I'm getting it. The key here is to basically localize the information to the mode, right? So if it happens in the Aeolian position, make a note of that. If it happens in the Phrygian position, make a note of that. So in the exercise, of course, you'll just see me sort of like messing around, I guess, showing you different variations of this slippery effect, right, by using the slippery notes, whether it's with arpeggios or scales or whatever it is. And then, of course, that's what you're going to try to practice too with whatever tools you have. If it's 2 different scales, then get on them. Obviously, it makes sense to sort of do like the harmonic minor into like the major modes. That's going to be a great one. Or the dominant 7 or diminished arpeggio into any of the other sort of major 7 or minor 7 or just major triad and minor triad. So have a whack at this idea, obviously, of hunting around on the fretboard, and then make a mental note of where you are so that you can recreate those results at will. Next. All right, next up here is the idea of duality, right? So essentially, every key has, again, this idea of the yin and yang, right? So you have 2 different perspectives of the same kind of essential information. It just gives you 2 flavors to play with. So again, it's not exactly the same. if you will, as the slippery notes or the pivot notes, but more in the sense that you can now use these two colors to build a lot of your sort of practice sessions. So you're working in two keys. You're no longer just working in one key anymore. So a prime example of that would be G major and D major. Or if you did any of the other ones, you'd be doing the 1 and the 5 chord, right? So it'd be C major and G major or whatever it is. And once you start thinking like that and playing like that, you'll get a much better appreciation about how these sounds blend together, right? So the idea of duality, you have to master that as a rule, that you're like, I'm bouncing between these two keys, and there are more, obviously, there are a lot more. And when I do, I get this really killer effect, and it's something that you have to practice and master. So after the practice exercise where I sort of demonstrate some simple ideas with duality, you'll hear me do an improv where I kind of put everything together with a backing track, and you're going to try to do something similar to that where you even enhance the level of melody, trying to work on phrasing and, again, levels of technicality. So let's get into it. All right, rule 3 here is essentially fluidity of ideas. So I think too many people overlook the fact that you're basically always thinking ahead, like a chess player, basically planning out their victory 5 or 6 moves in advance. We're doing the same thing, reacting to the real time, but also thinking about the future to be like, oh, well, I'm basically doing this right now, and I'd like to move into something like this, so it sets up this next thing, right? Essentially the exact same principle that you would apply with respect to formulating an idea and then having a conversation with somebody, right? But you're doing it with music now. So too many people are like, think about something in the moment without actually investing a little bit of mind share and to be like, what should I do next? Or consider what they just did previously and then do something in relation to that. That's the next level, obviously. So this idea of fluidity is just not just, you know, how flexible your fingers are. It's how well you can put ideas together, move from a pentatonic idea into an arpeggio idea that moves into a scale idea that moves into a chord idea. And you use all of the essential music theory and technical requirements to accomplish your goal, if you will. So that right there is a big one, is this sort of master plan constantly unfolding. So let's take a listen to the example and then we'll move into the next rule. All right, next up is interoperability. Of course, we've already talked about it, but basically the idea that you're going to combine techniques to minimize the chances that you're going to make mistakes on the fretboard and optimize the necessity if you actually have to play fast. Now, putting all of the, the moons and the planets in line like that, like the conjunction of 1,000 spheres, is very tricky to just instantly switch it on and just be like, go. So it takes a lot of practice and dedication, but it all starts with the idea that you're going to start to combine sort of like techniques like sweeps and alternate picking or sweeps and economy picking to start to practice those two elements together so that you get a synergy going on between them. And of course, it just gets faster and faster and faster, but I think too many people make the mistake of practicing just arpeggios and then they just practice scales instead of starting to cross-pollinate these ideas and be like, what happens if I ascend or descend in one and ascend in the other? So that can be an incredibly powerful tool. And of course, just start using different techniques like 3-in-1 or the sort of like Tom Quayle idea where it's right like a hybrid sort of situation with hammer-ons and pull-offs or with alternate picking or economy. So immediately you're starting to get the idea here that there's like this huge treasure trove of practice ideas that can be mined from just this one little tiny thing. So the first thing is the synergy of technique though, right? The interoperability of all of the various systems and starting to recognize this one goes with this one and making whatever a map in your mind. So let's get into the example. And of course, we're going to do another improv. Let's get on it. All right, next on the hit list here is system fluency. Essentially, moving between the systems is what's going to give you sort of the endless cycle of ideas and the variation necessary to keep your solos interesting and fresh. Plus, again, it gives you this ultimate workout where you're cross-pollinating all of these different sort of tools and techniques and whatnot into one sort of concerted and directed effort. So that's where the system fluency comes in. You can just instantly switch mindset to be like, I need to use the classical method here, or I need to basically use caged here, or I need to move into dominant 7 arpeggio territory here, and just know where you are and basically just deliver. Now, I know that sounds a little harsh and whatnot, but it's just like anything else. When you're driving your car and you see a turn coming that's, quite a ways away, 4 or 5 blocks, you can sort of be like, okay, I gotta get ready to turn. Well, we're doing the same thing with respect to music. We're training our ears to anticipate these pivot notes, these slippery notes, these transitions from one chord to the next. You're like, oh, that's moving from minor 7 into dominant 7. You're like, there's that dominant 7 chord. again, the sort of system fluency, you're like, oh, I want to jump into the dominant 7 arpeggio shapes and play a dominant 7 arpeggio over top of this chord. See what I mean? All of the sort of planets line up, and then boom, you just play it, and everybody's like, oh yeah, that was cool. That was awesome. So there it is. Let's get into the example. All right, the sixth rule, if you will, is the ability to essentially come up with your own customized practice sessions that are dynamic. It's really easy to get into 2D thinking, so you're just mastering the shapes, you're working on technique like alternate picking or whatever it is, sweeps, who knows. But the point being here is that you just start focusing in again on this one sequence of notes to the exclusion of all the other ones, and so you sort of block out all these other sounds that interact with what it is that you're actually practicing. And that's where the dynamic practice session has to come in, because these other sort of borrowed flavors are essential to make your solos hit harder and sound a lot more interesting. It's the sort of bouncing back and forth, the interplay between them, that really creates the magic. So as far as the session is concerned, you can see me using supervisory skills like, oh, I need to create a cadence here, so I do essentially D7 to G major pentatonic. And I do another one where I essentially do the Dorian position, where I use the dominant 7 inversion there, and of course the Dorian pentatonic. When I'm up at Phrygian, I'm like, I have to jump up to the Lydian position and use minor 7 flat 5 leading into this Phrygian pentatonic. And of course, again, you're starting to see me practice things where I use the pentatonic as the backbone to come back to, right? But I'm adding this new element in front of it to give me this sort of yin and yang effect, this sort of push and pull of music. So that's incredibly important. And when you start practicing like that, where you're starting to blend these two sounds, that's when you start to make the most forward progress. So again, you'll hear me do it this sort of, you know, straight up sort of practice exercise, but blending all of the elements together. Of course, there's diminished, there's dominant 7, there's cadences, there's sequences, there's slides, vibrato, there's the sort of basic music ideas, and of course, at the very end, there's another improv. And that's just it, is you should start to see that when you're practicing, it should come across as these sort of more expansive improvs. Now, obviously, I took a few takes to get it right, but I still leave the mistakes in there. So don't get too self-conscious about it. Just keep working towards developing your ear, and of course, developing dynamic practice sessions so that you can really start to see, okay, these two systems, they work well together in this instance. And then, of course, you've opened a big door, because that information is true about a whole bunch of things on the guitar. Right. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate every single one of you. We'll see you in the next one.